Way back in the 1980s, this pestiferous, pesky woman by the name of Bernadette Roberts, a Carmelite mystic par excellence, unsettled all her male superiors, including Thomas Keating, uh, by suggesting outrageously that the unitive state too is not a steady state. It's not like climbing up on Mount Everest and watching the view. That it's the beginning of a progression that leads the way to yet another dark night, which you could call, and I put this name on it, Thomas or Bernadette never did really, the dark night of self. And that what happens very, very, very gradually in this final progression of the dark night is that what begins to happen is it's not a union of wills, but a collapse or a transcendence, whichever language you want to use, of the basic self-reflective mechanism of consciousness that allows you to establish a me pole and an object pole. And in other words, to be able to say, I love God. This sounds sort of totally basic, huh? But you notice you have to have an I, and God becomes an object. And the whole way we conceive of ourselves, that's what we mean by self-reflective. Or we look back on ourselves and say, well, how's Cynthia doing right now? Is she 9/10 of the way down her spiritual journey? Well, that whole mechanism collapses. And it's in the face of it, what it takes out is both me and God. And what remains is simply unity. And yet this unity is not brain dead. It's alive and crawling with a kind of object-less, bright, luminous, joyful awareness. But it just doesn't get parceled out and divided between me and God. That whole mechanism is entirely gone. So Thomas was among the ones that gave Bernadette a hard time back in the 1980s when she suggested it. And they all said to her, no, dearie, you're just talking about the death of the ego. And she said, no, I'm talking about the death of the self, the collapse of this mechanism of consciousness that allows us to define a self in the first place. She says there's life beyond the self. And that was what Thomas was to experience powerfully in the last, particularly 5 years of his life. And I was pretty close to him at this time, and I watched him go through it. He'd always been fascinated by these models in some of the Eastern traditions. And he found himself living into it as he realized that all is well, and that what seems to just drop out somewhere along the way is this translator mechanism called Thomas. And he mentions this beautifully. I just wanted to call attention to a couple of little poems. He says in the first poem, Out of the Stone, as the false self diminishes, the ego becomes a servant. Everything turns to poetry, and everything becomes a movement of divine love. But the separate self lingers on. So here, even in this poem, she's making the distinction between the ego self and the separate self. And then he says, when the separate self has been laid to rest, the divine presence alone remains, and the creator of all becomes all in all. It's like the oceans come together over the island that has disappeared under the wake of it. And in one of the poems, he has a shocking comment that, as far as I know, this goes farther than anyone I've ever read in the Western tradition. When he says, when there is no more me, myself, or mine, only I am remains. Of course, I am being the great name both for self or God. And then he says, then the I may fall away, leaving just the am. At the point you go, yo, he has just gone beyond approximately 3,000 years of Western spiritual experience there.